Representative Larson. Representative Sherwood. Representative Stith.
Here.
Representative Walters. Representative Swanitzer.
Here.
Our Chairman Nicholas.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Elizabeth Martineau with the Legislative Service Office Budget Fiscal Division, and my colleague Catherine Camerati and I are here today to provide an update on the actions taken by the Senate on Senate File 1 last week. In terms of process, it is my understanding that you will present the Senate amendments and actions to your colleagues in the House early this week, possibly today or tomorrow, depending on your chamber. To help in this presentation, we have 4 handouts in front of you. They're paper clipped together and were placed on your chair. First is an updated goldenrod. It has a couple of separate columns denoting the different actions. There is the 23 and 24 columns as well, because you had some effective immediately actions that affect that biennium. For reference, the goldenrod has columns J and P on the first page for the House and L and R for the Senate. And then on the subsequent pages, it is L and R for the House and N and T for the Senate. The next handout you have is a large tabloid size 1-pager that's on the high-level comparison of the differences between the chambers. We'll go into that in more detail shortly. Next, you should have your standing committee report that will go into the journal. And finally, you should have 2 11x17 papers. One is dated at the bottom corner, 225 at 338, and it is 5 pages. That is the Senate amendments, and we will be going over those. And then for your benefit, we also provided your summary of the House amendments. I would note, if you're taking notes on any of these documents, other than the goldenrod, they're only good for about a day. We're going to go ahead and combine those documents into one for the JCC proper, so I would be careful of using these documents other than just for informational purposes at this time. In terms of the remaining process, it is my understanding that following your floor presentations, you will have 5 members assigned from the JCC on the House side and 5 members assigned on the Senate side. The JCC will then meet as necessary to discuss the differences between your chambers, and we will provide documentation and support during that process. I was going to go over the goldenrod, but it is a unique version of the goldenrod, and I think the simpler place to see the differences between the 2 chambers this time is that 1-page summary. And so I'm going to direct our attention to the 1-page summary now. And we're just going to go over some highlights of kind of the differences, because we've had quite a few questions on those items.
Chairman. Beth, just make sure, so we're on the document that says high-level summary?
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course. These are organized by funds at the top, and then kind of purposes in the middle, and then a couple of other details towards the bottom. So at the top, and this was a surprise to staff when we actually did the numbers and calculations, including all divided amendments, the House, as you can see, had 70 amendments, and the Senate had 63. There's only a difference of 7 amendments between the 2 chambers, despite having a record number of amendments drafted and numbered.
Mr. Chairman. So Beth, what does that mean? There's only a difference of 7. Are you saying that all of a number of these failed? These are the number of 70 in the House were adopted, 63 in the Senate were adopted. All are mirrors except for 7?
Nope, that's the next line, line 2. You only have 13 of those that are mirror amendments.
What does the difference mean then?
The difference is that you guys had 70 numbered amendments and we had 63.
Oh, the difference in the number of amendments. I'm sorry.
That's what that third column
Thank you.
represents, is just the straight difference between your positions.
Thank you.
Of course. Mr. Chairman, going to the first line, it's line 3 in this. That's the general fund difference. The House has $132 million spent, whereas the Senate has $7 million, or a difference of $124 million. For the SIPA, this one is one of the bigger differences between the chambers. You had $25 million you spent, mainly dealing with capital construction, and the Senate reduced $226 million for a difference of $250 million. Another big difference is in the LSRA. You guys retained Section 320, and the Senate eliminated Section 320, which accounts for that $200 million difference. And the kind of like the last big difference is in the SFP. There was some additions here in the House, but the biggest difference is the Senate eliminated the large capital construction holding account and some of the capital construction for K-12. So we have a difference of $349 million between the positions. We have for the water account appropriation, you retained the JAC position to have those funds coming out of water, and the Senate moved those funds. Finally, we gave you an all-in number because there was quite a bit of other numbers throughout. In total, all funds, you expended in the House $362 million, and the Senate reduced around $767 million for a difference between the chambers of $1.1 billion.
What's a billion here or there?
Mr. Chairman. The next big section kind of gives you just an overview. I know you know your amendments, so I won't go through those in too many details. But this gives you just kind of a comparison of the big numbers differences between the Senate and the House. For example, you had the Veterans Home Edition of $69 million general fund, and it goes from there. Moving to about line 21 in that list, you will see the Senate differences, the $200 million that we spoke about previously, the K-12 reduction, and we will get into these as we move through the Senate sheet, so I will provide details on each of these. This is just more to kind of high level show you where some of the bigger differences are. Next, we have a couple of unique ideas that were in the Senate, lines 30 through 35, and these are impacts to revenues or moving funds around. And so we had, we'll discuss those again in just a moment when we go through the sheet, but we had some pretty unique differences between the House and Senate position. And finally, kind of unique to what I have seen, there is quite a bit of language difference, substantive language difference. And so we've just listed a few of those examples to give you guys kind of an idea of what you may be looking at. For example, differences in how to handle the border state, differences in UW family care, whether it's for prenatal and veterans or just veterans, the LSRA backstop, and you can read there's quite a few, more than I've seen in quite some time. Are there any questions on the high-level summary?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Elizabeth, on the general fund increase in the House of $132,795,000, I had thought that it was $147 million, but that there was a $15 million adjustment. And was that adjustment because we spent out of the current biennium, or is that $15 million adjustment from something else?
And I will, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, have to phone a friend as that was a House action.
Representative Stith, Mr. Chairman, that $15 million, I believe what you're referring to is the savings on the SIPA. So rather than transfer the full 174 to the SIPA, you transferred $160 million. So that is the difference. We did not include that in the top grouping. And the reason being is that's a bit like a transfer and a revenue. And if we included that, then we were faced with the challenge of, well, how do you treat rows 30 through 35 of the Senate, which are doing some similar transfer things. So we tried to keep those separate, appropriations only, and then revenue and transfers separately.
Mr. Chairman, I kind of previewed it, but for the amendment summary, we had a record number on both sides this year. The Senate numbered 126 amendments, and of those, they adopted 63. As I mentioned previously, there were 13 identical amendments, so those will not be discussed by JCC, as a majority of both chambers did adopt those. And there were 37, I'd say there's 13 that were related, and that'll be a section in the sheet we'll go through. And then 37 of the amendments were unique to the Senate this time. However, I would note that about 26 of those are ideas that you'll be familiar with. Either they were an amendment that was drafted and numbered and withdrawn, or it was one that failed on your side and was successful on the Senate side. So if some of these seem familiar, that might be because you might have had that debate previously. I will note that the 13 identical amendments account for about $2.8 million general fund. So there's not much in the identicals, it's more language. When we move to this sheet, you will see 3 sections. The first section on page 1 will be identical, and then the bottom of that will start related, and then we will move into unrelated items. So now we will move through the sheet. And if you have any questions on these, please stop me as I go through. The identicals start with Senate third reading number 1, Baldwin, was identical to House second reading 5 for Zwanitzer. And this was $20,000 for the Lifesaver program, and it was a feasibility study. It's a new idea that wasn't contemplated in the introduced bill. Senate 3002 Nethercott is identical to House third reading 74 Davis. It's of this appropriation, so it was not new money. $850,000 were to support 2 full-time state positions in the governor's office for the statewide association representing counties.
Mr. Chairman. Beth, I was trying to remember, we try to keep that count at $1 million. Does that sound right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that does sound correct. For the NERPA account, or the Federal Natural Resource Policy account.
Yep, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I thought, normally it's $1 million, but I thought we'd added an extra $1 million in the budget.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's correct, but historically, we've maintained $1 million. We added $1 million largely because of what we have going on right now. My point is we historically have kept it at $1 million, and now we've committed ongoing an expenditure of $850,000 that we're going to have to bear and take into mind as we move into our next type of hearings. There will be pressure, I'm sure, to increase that.
Mr. Chairman, moving Senate second reading 10 Barlow is identical to House second reading 8 Somers, and this is simply to make agriculture in the classroom for $300,000 ongoing in the standard budget. Senate third reading 7 Nethercott is the same as House second reading 18 Brown, and this is $250,695 for trauma designation and education. Senate second reading 30 Hicks is...
Mr. Chairman, yes, and Elizabeth, that's for hospitals.
Correct.
Not a general education, but for those providers that, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, during the debate, it was discussed that this is a program within the Department of Health that they're trying to support.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Senate second reading 30 Hicks is the same as, or identical as House second reading 57 Alameda, and this is to reduce the $700,000 for the Rose Parades. Senate second reading 38 Hicks is identical to House second reading 26 Davis, and this is a new $2.5 million for support and excellence in research, education, and extension. This isn't really a new one. This was a footnote in last year's budget as well. Next, we have,
Did it pass last year?
yes,
So
Mr.
this-
Chairman, yes, it was in the,
It's stacked.
Mr. Chairman. Senate second reading 45 Nethercott is identical to House second reading 32 Zwanitzer, and this is just requiring the Office of Administrative Hearings to provide services to the community colleges. Next, Senate second reading 46 Ellis is identical to the House third reading 29 for Walters, and this is adding additional language to the existing footnote regarding security, integrity, fairness of activity or gaming activities, just to make sure that language is in there. Next, Senate third reading 34 Landon is identical to House second reading 38 Brown, and this is just the addition of $1.8 million for charter school leases in 2 counties. Next, Senate second reading 52 Kinski is identical to House second reading 39 Nicholas. This was just a technical correction to make sure that those monies, the $24 million, were split into the correct accounts. Senate second reading 56 Landon is identical to House second reading 42 Nicholas, and this is for the Spanish-American War Monument, and it was $75,000, of which $37,000 is effective immediately. Senate second reading 57 Boner is identical to House second reading 47 Brown, and that is for fire suppression on military-owned lands. Last, we have Senate third reading 52 is identical for House third reading 73 Washit, and this is for the shooting complex and allowing them to use up to $50,000 of their existing funds for this purpose, and that ends the identical section. Moving on, We have the related sections, Mr. Chairman. We are starting with concepts that might be related, so this is a staff judgment, so if you feel that they are not related, that is within your purview. Senate third reading 67 Kinski and House third reading 89 for Nicholas are just the technical amendments, and most of those are unique to the amendments you had on your side or our side. Senate second reading 1 Hicks is very similar or related to a multiple of amendments you had on your side. House second reading 49 for Angelos, House second reading 2003 for Harshman, and House third reading number 2 for Swanitzer. And these all relate with how we would like to fund the support of Texas or the United States border. On the Senate side, they just provided $2 million going to the state of Texas. Next, another related item we have is Senate second reading 5 for Larson. Dan is related to House third reading number 4 for Nicholas, and this deals with the Secretary of State's office. We included these as identicals because the Senate removed this footnote, and if I am correct, the House added other footnotes. So those are related ideas. Turning to page 2, Senate third reading number 4 for Nethercott is similar or related to House second reading 7 for O'Hearn, and this is that land exchange. The only difference here from the Senate and House positions is the Senate specified it's going to the common school account within the permanent land fund, whereas the House left it to the account from which it came. The next related ideas are Senate second reading 16 Hicks and House second reading 15 for Crago, and that's just to clarify, there's a suite of these, actually, there's 2, to clarify that it's to provide grants for those invasive grasses. And then the next amendment, Senate second reading 19 Hicks, is the same, and this is where the addition of the $5 million for invasive grasses was. Next, we have Senate third reading 6 for Hutchings is related to House second reading 53 for Penn and House third reading 10 for Crago, and this has to do with this idea of putting a footnote on the Department of Health to ensure that no funds are expended for gender transition or gender reassignments or abortions on any persons. Next, we have Senate second reading 22 for Scott and House third reading 12 from Byron, and this has to do with the preschool ECA for those children with disabilities. The Senate took that position that those should be coming from the general fund and not the S5 or the school foundation program, and it's related to the Byron amendment since you added an additional $4 million. Next, we have the Mammoth Jackstock Donkeys, second reading, Senate second reading 25 Hicks, and Senate third reading 8 for Driscoll, and then those are both related to House second reading 22 for Davis. Initially, they had deleted or added this footnote, and then it was deleted in the third reading. Next, we have Senate second reading 15 Nethercott is related to House third reading 18 Zwanitzer, and this is the $250,000 in a new footnote at the University of Wyoming for family medical residency. The only difference here is the Senate specified for veteran services only, and I believe the House added prenatal care. Senate second reading 53 Hicks is similar to House second reading 41 for Nicholas, and this relates to the decreasing the $150,000. The Senate deleted Section 320, and I believe you added some language on the House side. Senate third reading 44 Hicks is related to House third reading 76 Nicholas and House third reading 86 Nicholas, all related to the Kelly parcel, and this relates to, on the Senate side, adding hunting and grazing rights. Finally, for the related sections, we have Senate third reading 50 for Nethercott and House third reading 55, and this is the American Rescue Plan, adding that new section 397. The difference is that there is a bit of a language difference towards the end of the notes. That is the end of the related section. And now we move into the 37 unrelated items, or some of these are or may be familiar to you. Start with Senate second reading number 2 with Boner in the Office of the Governor. We've added $500,000 for a study of WYDOT's practices and procedures. Next, Senate third reading number 3 for Kinski. added $171,000 in the Secretary of State's office for those printing obligations. However, we would note that as of yesterday, there was only one joint resolution active, and so this actually could be reduced to about $54,000 if that was the wish of the JCC. Next, Senate Second Reading 13 Larson is a removal of the Arboretum, $5 million, and those two AWECs. Next, Senate Third Reading Steinmetz is, as we discussed previously, the Senate position was to have those funds for the State Engineer's Office come from the general fund, as opposed to the JAC position, which was out of the Water Fund. Next, Senate Second Reading 26 for IDE is related to one Senate Third Reading 64 for Kinski. They removed the oil and gas major maintenance footnote, and instead the Senate put that footnote or similar language in section 308. Continuing on to the second row on the third page.
Mr. Chairman? Question there, so why wouldn't footnote 8 and then, so we put it in the, we've got it in the budget. We had, JAC had that position in the budget as a footnote, right?
Mr.
Okay,
Chairman,
that-
Representative
okay, so
Larson, yes.
I answered my own question, so very good. I think we had it as an amendment.
Moving on to the second row, second reading 31 for Steinmetz is a decrease of the $2 million for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and the JAC position is keeping that in, or was keeping that in the bill. Senate Third Reading number 12 for Hicks is specifying that the University of Wyoming, starting in the 2027-2028 biennium, will follow a standard budget practice. Senate Third Reading 13 for Steinmetz added a new footnote that no general funds or any funds of the university will be expended on gender studies, gender co-curricular programs. They did permit students who have those majors to continue until they are out of the program, and then at that point, they would discontinue. Senate Third Reading 14 Steinmetz is a decrease of $1.7 million, and it eliminates the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at the university, and it prevents any funds from being used on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or functions. Senate Third Reading 18 for Hicks is unique, and it includes language to make sure that the University of Wyoming will work to have some sort of agreement for the Wyoming seed certification services, either with a crop association or someone else.
Mr. Chairman? Go ahead. Elizabeth, would this then just be for the biennium?
Yes.
That's right. And so if they wanted that to be ongoing, it would have been in session law, right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, correct.
Thank you.
Senate Third Reading 21 IDE is an elimination of the $2 million for the Economic Development Laboratory at the Wyoming Business Council. The Senate in Second Reading 42 for IDE, Senate Third Reading 23 for Rothfuss, and Senate Third Reading 24 for Driscoll. Originally, the Senate had deleted the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. It was brought back by Senate in third reading, and then it was amended with some additional language to make sure that it is with Wyoming domiciled entities only. Moving on, we have Senate Third Reading 26 IDE. It is a decrease of 1 FTE in the Department of Education. Next, Senate Second Reading 47.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that removal of the position in the WDE, is that the hearing position that we added?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, no, that is not that position as far as I'm aware.
Mr. Chairman? This would have been one of the two positions in, and I want to say in the school foundation administration, where we added two positions, then increased some salaries? Or is
Mr.
this-
Chairman, Representative Larson, slightly different. It was testimony during Senate hearing, during the Senate discussion of this amendment that to keep the position that they wanted in the finance unit, the superintendent was willing to give up another position within her agency.
This was the government-funded position? Or funded with federal dollars is what I should say.
And this was, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, it was to, the way it is to the discretion, whichever position the superintendent would like to eliminate. There is no specificity or footnote related.
At her discretion.
At her discretion.
Thank you.
Senate second reading 47 for Hicks is the deletion of the large school capital construction holding account, or that $200 million S5. Senate third reading 30 for Beitman is the elimination of $20 million for the Wyoming's Tomorrow Scholarship Endowment. Senate third reading 31 is just some cleanup language that we had to make sure that we had those effective immediately off of those two items as part of our budget balancing efforts. Senate third reading 32 for Hutchings just deletes maquettes from that section 300M, but it does keep the security bollards. Senate second reading 48 for Brennan.
Sure. And with that, on the maquettes, it keeps the total value in there, but just the maquettes removed.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that is correct. Senate second reading 48 for Brennan is the decrease of the $10 million for the State Museum construction account. And finally, on this page, Senate second reading 49 Nethercott is a deletion of the ADM calculation, or that section 302. Moving to page 4.
Mr. Chairman, can we go back to that? On that, so Section 302 amended the ADM down to 75%. What does this one do? And it looks like it's just for 2 biennium.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, this just deletes section 302 entirely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 4 at the very top. Senate third reading 35 Hicks has 2 parts, Division 1 and Division 2, and this one was to eliminate design, construction, and parts of the unanticipated costs for K-12, for Section 313 K-12 capital construction. Then they also added in about $8 million for Sweetwater 1 High School as a component level major maintenance project as a part of that motion.
What was that for?
The backflow permit.
On the 8 million?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters indicated it was for the backflow, and I do
Yeah.
agree that was.
For the what?
Backflow preventer.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman, Senate third reading 36 from Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna go back to that one. When I was researching it, I thought they also took out the $3.5 million to purchase that part of the school in the Trumbull County. Was I off on my lines?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that was the third division that failed. So they left the $3.5 million in the bill.
Thank you.
Of course.
so what was the total add and subtract?
They added $8 million and they removed $110 million. Mr. Chairman, moving on to Senate third reading 36 for Hicks. This is section 314, and there was just some language difference in there to make sure that the secondary cap, 100% of the additional will go to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. And then for the common schools, it deleted that secondary cap, and now 100% of that will go, I think this might be a typo.
So walk
To the
us
common
through
schools.
a little slowly the total dollar amounts and where they go under this amendment.
It's $108 million.
That'll go to the PMTF. That goes to PMTF instead of being diverted. And then the same, we decrease that amount that would have gone for that tip to the common school account.
And it would have been 1/3 of the general fund, 1/3 of the budget reserve account, 1/3 of the SFP.
No, Mr. Chairman, this is the 1%, so it's not the secondary cap. The 1% severance tax, it's about $54 million a year, $108 million for the biennium, is that 1/2. And 100% of it will go to the PMTF rather than the Common School Permanent Land Fund 50/50 split.
And we had it 50/50.
Correct, and you'll recall this started about 3 years ago, and it's in statute, not a budget amendment. And then in 2029, it goes to, I believe it's 1/4, or 1/3, 2/3 in
Right.
2029.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, third reading 38 is for section 315, and this just deletes entirely that section. And that was the federal mineral royalty diversion. It was based on the 2024 January Craig estimates, and I believe that was 0 at this time. Mr. Chairman, next.
Mr. Chairman,
Go.
so Elizabeth, is the effect of this deletion of the secondary cap on federal mineral royalties that if there is revenue over the cap, that it'll just go to the budget reserve account instead of going, for example, partially into the school foundation program? Is that the effect of it?
It'll just flow as it would otherwise in law, which I believe is 2/3 to the Brown, 1/3 to the SFP. I'm looking to Don to be sure. This just eliminates that secondary cap that's on there now.
And for a little bit more context, if I might, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, so the current law is 1/3, 2/3. The provision in the budget would have been a 60-40 split. So 7% less is going to go towards schools if Craig underestimates.
Mr. Chairman, moving on to third reading 39 Anderson. This is an elimination of section 316, that's $75 million that was going to go to the University of Wyoming for the Centers for Innovation for Flow Through Porous Media. And instead, that $75 million is transferred to the LSRA. Next is Senate third reading 41 for Steinmetz. And this is in section 318, it makes section 321, so 2023 section 321 and 2023 section 325. It sweeps those funds immediately to the LSRA. Within the same amendment, they deleted section 323, which was that $200 million for the large projects. Next, Senate second reading 54 for Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, and Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, so I believe that on that section, on those energy matching funds, I want to say that's 321, is that right? That's currently being administered by the Wyoming Energy Authority. They have obligations in place, but not contracts. If those contracts are not in place, governor signs it, the funds are removed, and those commitments would not be honored.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is correct, that there has to be some encumbrance.
Right.
And there are projects that do have encumbrances, and then there are projects that are in process. A couple of important points on this, and it's in the text of the explanation, but this has some fairly wide ranging impacts. Number one, this is effective immediately upon signature. It applies not only to 321, which is the energy matching funds, it would also apply to the infrastructure matching funds. Right now, approximately $6 million of the $75 million is under obligation. The balance is not and would not be able to be under obligation. Moreover, just last point on this, recall you funded $25 million of clean water and drinking water from this section. Obviously, those can't have any obligations because they didn't have any authority, so all of that goes away as well through this amendment.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, as I read it, it appears there's still $5 million outstanding in the hinterlands because it was $80 million in 2027. We took that $80 million and spent 75 of it for the university project that was deleted in the previous amendment. But in this one, they reduced $5 million out, and then took the remaining $5 million and put it into 321. But they take that $5 million back out, and I'm struggling to track where that $5 million is up because only $75 million got transferred to LSRA on the AEW project, and the $5 million is decreased, so they're only removing $50 million. So
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, or Walters, those will revert as required by law.
thank
Moving to the next, kind of in the middle here, we're on Senate Second Reading 54, and we are looking at Section 325, and that was the state employer paid employee retiree contributions. They decreased the 3.4 million and deleted that section entirely. Moving on to the next amendment, Senate's Third Reading 46 for French, deletes entirely Section 326, which was enterprise inflation. Next, Senate Third Reading 48 for French again, deletes entirely Section 329, which was employee compensation, or about $18 million general fund. Next, Senate Third Reading 53 for Steinmetz is the executive branch position savings and funds deposit. This removes 42 positions from the budget. These are unfilled positions or vacant positions as of July 1, 2024, and the idea is to have an annual savings generated of about $3.6 million, and that's using one FTE is equivalent to about $87,000.
Mr. Chairman.
So did they specify the positions?
Mr. Chairman, no, they left that to the governor's discretion to pick which of those 42 positions of his newly filled or vacant positions he would like to take.
So why did they use July 1, 24?
Mr. Chair,
Whatever is on the list at that time.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is there was 107 new positions added to the governor's budget, and after staff worked with the bringer of the amendment, we brought that number down to about 84. There were some swaps like DFS's 18 PT at part-time positions that went to full-time positions. It didn't make sense to pull those from in this amendment. And so they dropped that number down to about 84. We had a couple more that we identified as swaps as well. And then of those 107 new positions, they decided they wanted to do half of the 84 that remained. Excluding the judicial branch.
Mr. Chairman, so I've got two questions. I was trying to figure out if they're just trying to reduce the number of FTEs or if they're trying to have a budget savings of 3.6.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, it is both. They're trying to reduce the number of ongoing FTEs in the governor's budget, and the only way staff tried to calculate out the exact, you've seen the positions, they're spread out through the budget book, there's quite a few of them. And so this was a way to get to the savings as well without having to go through and capture some of those other details.
So would it be fair to say that they restrict on how he can make the budget savings? It has to be within Series 100 rather than giving flexibility across the executive branch to save an additional 3.6?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct. The idea is to save 3.6 million annually in 100 series.
Is this somewhat similar to an amendment maybe we had in 2016 with the previous governor that where we tried to do this?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes, that was the basis for this amendment.
And remind us what happened on that. Did the governor veto that? Did he just not? Can you remember how that all went?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, in our research, we did note that if you look at the session law book, there was parts of this amendment, this entire section 320 for reference. It was session law 2017, section 320. And if you do look, there are parts of that that were vetoed. However, that had a broader implication because there was more going on than just trying to do position reductions. They were also trying to combat some of the challenging fiscal kind of situations that you guys had in terms of vacant positions and what we were going to fund. And so yes, parts of that were vetoed, however, they were overrode by the legislature. And it does note that throughout there, which parts of that amendment, or which parts of that section were successful and were not.
Thank you.
So there was initially a correlation of taking away the new positions that were created?
Mr. Chairman, yes, there was a desire to take away quite a number of those new positions.
Go ahead, Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little bit of additional context on this. The Senate gave the governor flexibility such that if he wanted to keep the new positions, he could, in lieu of cutting half of those, he could cut any other vacancy. However, in adding this flexibility, they added a lot of flexibility in that they will not get any credit for the $3.6 million annually in savings. That will have to be achieved, but he can take it from any fund he wants. So YDOT, federal funds. So you will not see this $7.2 million savings in the profile because it could all be from other or federal funds depending on his choices. So he has a fair bit of flexibility with their amendment.
And I would add, Mr. Chairman, that was the intent of the Senate, was to make sure he had the flexibility versus going into the tables and pulling out these positions. Mr. Chairman, moving on to the fifth and final page for the Senate amendments.
So, at some point, it would be useful for each one of these to give us the vote count.
Mr. Chairman, moving to the next Senate third reading 54 for Hicks is another spending policy change. And this one is decreasing, so there is the reserve account, the amount of interest and earnings for the reserve accounts. And in the second part of this, pardon me, is that piece where they're taking 1/2 of those earnings and directing them back to the corpus instead of the reserve account. So for example, the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account, 1/2 of those earnings will go into the corpus, which is about $18.5 million, and the same is done for the Common School Permanent Land Fund reserve accounts. The top of this is a change in the spending policy from 5% to 4.5%, and the net effect of that is a potential of $94 million for the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and a potential net effect of $47.3 million for the Common School account. Moving to the second to last amendment, this one is by far the largest. This is Senate third reading 55. And this one has a lot of wide-ranging implications. The simplest way to explain this one to your colleagues on the floor is we are stopping SIPA for 2 years. And so some of these, what you're seeing here in these different lines is to account for the stop of SIPA. So for example, there was $19 million in the University of Wyoming that was funded from SIPA that is now going to be funded from the general fund. There was a transfer, that next line, and Section 308, they related to the use for major maintenance. We are stopping the transfer completely, and major maintenance will come now from the general fund. Finally, Section 312 is kind of, on the Senate side, Section 312 was not going to be effective because House Bill 135 did not pass, but there we do have to account for that $9.3 million that is in there. It just goes away on the Senate side. Finally, there is a couple of other implications, and when you read the amendment, for example, for the state penitentiary capital construction account, there is a backstop that was coming from SIPA, and that was $10 million a year. And since we are now no longer doing that from SIPA, it will be from the general fund. You're seeing $30 million because we need to cover the biennium and then 1 more year. And finally, one of the things that the amendment did is that anything that was paid from or would be paid from SIPA is now from the general fund. And so that did create quite a bit of complexity. So that's why I say when you look at your goldenrod, it is a bit complex and kind of different at the moment. And so you can see that on the goldenrod, it's for 25, 26 in the Senate columns, all zeros for SIPA.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Elizabeth, I have a question on the $30 million transfer from SIPA to general fund for the prison account. Why is it, and you said it was $10 million a year, so why are there 3 years? Is it because they made it effective immediately, so it happens this current biennium as well?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stitt, that is correct, because this is effective immediately. We needed to account for this year and then for the 25-26 biennium as well. The last amendment we have is Senate third reading 56 for Hicks, and this is that no transfer from the LSRA shall be made to the school foundation program. This is essentially to stop that $100 million backstop that is on there now. And that concludes all of the Senate amendments.
Elizabeth, that prevention of the backstop, or elimination of the backstop, I should say, of 100 million is just for this biennium. And we have strong estimates that would suggest that those backstops would not be necessary, or that 100 million, there's nothing in the SCORE Foundation.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think Elizabeth was encouraged or directed to get her summary done in an hour, and I think she did that. But to your point, I think it is worth spending 5 minutes on the goldenrod. Historically, in the last 3 months, we have indicated that there is no risk of the SFP going underwater. That is no longer the case. For both the House and the Senate side, I think the risk is dramatically higher. And that reason is the amount of property tax bills that remain alive. And we've looked at that and said, are we double counting? So you can remember in some prior years, we had dueling capital construction bills, both the House and the Senate. We counted them both because that was our practice. And then we told everybody, ignore the goldenrod, we're double counting. I don't think we can say that at this time. And the reason I say that is you could have 50% tax relief to long-term Wyoming homeowners. You could have a reduction in the assessment rate. You could have an assessment credit of $50,000, $200,000, $400,000. All of those bills could pass. And they really have limited interaction with each other. They could be stacked on top of each other. So there's no longer the ability to say, hey, LSO is just double counting. Some of these will fail, some of these will pass. They could all pass, and if you move to page 4, and I am trying to get to you the answer of your question, on page 4 of the goldenrod, for example, in the House position, and you didn't really spend much more on the SFP. The only thing the House added was 18.5 million for that mental health grants, relatively modest amount. You will see in that page 4, column R, line 22, we are forecasting the need for $22 million from the LSRA backstop. So yes, we have said that $500 million would not be necessary, the backstop of the LSRA. That's no longer the case. And you can see the reason why is those revenue bills, which impact both the recapture as well as the entitlement districts. In addition, the House has deposited that $200 million into another account, the large school holding account for future capital construction. So that takes $200 million off the table as well. But you see, there is a scenario. In fact, it's not just a scenario, it's the current House position that will require the LSRA to backstop the SFP this biennium, this next biennium.
So, Mr. Chairman, so Don, as a follow-up, does that mean that if the Senate amendment were to go through, but otherwise House positions were to prevail, that your $100 million statutory minimum would just be depleted by the $22 million?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff, that is correct. And I know mid-stage, you kind of have to make your own determination about what Senate positions will pass, what House positions will pass. But it's worth noting that neither position standing on its own ends up in the traditional manner. So at the top of page 3, the budget reserve account, I would expect to have $155 million left over in the budget reserve account. That is referred to as the statutory reserve amount. You don't have to. That's 5% of forecast general fund revenue. You do not have to leave here with 5%. This body has left once, that in my memory, over the past 30 years, when you did not. Neither House is anywhere close to the $155 million. You will see the House position is at 20 million, the Senate position is at 12 million. So this characterization pervades through the goldenrod, and what you will see is when you get to page 4, the reserve accounts, strong balances, very large, pushing $800 million balances. So you've taken money from pages 2 and 3 and 4 and shifted it, both houses, to page 5. You also don't have differences to unwind that. Your deposits of $100 million are the same on both sides. To the corpus, your deposits of $190 million to the reserve accounts are the same on both sides. So those are not options for negotiation. So what you might want to consider is some of these large appropriations for tax relief. Do you want to either backfill the local governments or schools with LSRA rather than the general fund to bring that into balance? I'm just offering one option to avoid going into the budget and trying to balance that.
And Mr. Chairman, to Representative Larson's second point, the budget's only good for the 2 years, so all of these Senate actions are only active for 2 years.
Thank you.
So Don, just so we understand it as we're moving forward, why don't you explain to the committee what happens if we go to an open committee and the timing of that?
Mr. Chairman, under the rules, the JCC 01 will be appointed. You don't necessarily have to meet. You can call that a failed committee, or you can come to a negotiation, return to your bodies, and maybe one of those bodies does not adopt the resolution. That's two ways that you can arrive at a JCC 02, which is a free committee. A free committee, all of this goes away. You have the Joint Appropriations Committee bill as introduced, and any amendment on any agency in any amount is on the table. It will take us a while to write that. It's not something overnight. The last time this occurred was, I believe, 1999, and the House and the Senate agreed on 10 amendments. We will limit it to 10 amendments. Then they negotiated what those 10 amendments were, but they said, we will have 10 amendments to the budget bill. And they adopted those amendments. We could write it, 10 amendments versus 130, we can write. Whatever action the legislature takes under calendar number 1, which is that calendar adopted by Management Council, which means sine die next Friday, the governor, if you wish to override or have an opportunity to override the governor's veto, the budget bill needs to be on his desk by midnight 1 week from today, next Monday. If you don't wish to override, it needs to be on his desk by midnight next Friday. He will have 15 days, and he will be able to vote or override or veto any provision in there, and you will no longer have your opportunity to override. There is calendar number 2. Calendar number 2 is you could incorporate the last 3 days that you carried over from the general session. You only met for 37 days. You did not meet for your full 40. So the Constitution provides for 60 days of legislative meetings in any 2-year period. So you have 3 days that you could add, which would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the next week. And calendar number 3, this has only been used once in my memory, is you have extended the session by meeting once every 3 days or so. So you come in, and I believe it was the House, there was a majority for a quorum to come in once every few days, and you could literally extend the session out several weeks by doing that. It's only happened once when we were over in Jonah. What that does is it continues the clock on the bills that you have adopted for purposes of potential override of the governor's vetoes.
And then let's assume that we don't have a budget, that the open committee can't reach a resolution. And how do you count the days, and when would the most likely special session occur between now and July 1?
Mr. Chairman, I can't forecast that. The governor has the ability to call you back into session. I have no idea when he would elect to do that. You can also call yourselves back into session, but again, I can't predict that.
But I guess then my question is, let's assume that we need to create the budget again. Would that entail appropriations meeting first, and then coming up with a new budget, and then just walk us through the process of passing that budget in a special session?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So under the special session scenario, hypothetically, let's say it's April 15th. Based upon the practices of your prior special sessions, medical malpractice, workers' comp, the COVID special sessions, a committee or supercommittee met preceding that. Presumably, for the budget, it would be the Joint Appropriations Committee, and develop its base budget. For purposes only of expediency, the special sessions of the recent past, meaning the last 25 years, have used the mirror budget process, just like the budget bill process. But that is not a requirement. The budget rules would not necessarily apply to a special session. So you could move whatever product is developed through the Joint Appropriations Committee or another appointed committee. You could move it through the normal process, meaning standing committee, committee of the whole for second and third reading of the initial House, crossover and redo that. But that takes time, right? It just takes time. And then at the end of that, presumably, you have a similar situation which you are faced with right now, differences between the houses, and you would need a joint conference committee, potential for multiple days, just like you're faced with this week. Then it takes some time to turn that product around, ideally a weekend, and then vote on it, and then a question of how long do you wish to hang around or stay in session to ensure your opportunity to have a reaction to any governor's vetoes. So you can envision a scenario where it would be tough, almost impossible to do in a week or even two. You're looking at it. The last 2 weeks have been pretty full. So if you're going to recreate that process, it is realistically a several-week endeavor.
Mr. Chairman. Don, a follow-up question, and thank you so much for taking us through those pieces of the goldenrod. In some ways, it's not a surprise on page 3 that the House position leaves us with about $20 million in the budget reserve account because, well, we have all these property tax bills, those are expensive, and through all of our amendments, we spent an extra $132 million, of which $69 million was the Veterans Home and $40 million for the 988 hotline, so those are big chunks of money. So that's not a surprise. What does surprise me, though, that the Senate in the budget reserve account ends up with even less money, $12 million, as opposed to the 20 that the House has, which comes as a somewhat intuitive surprise, since if you first look at the sheet, it looks like the Senate is slashing and burning, and yet they're coming out, you know, with substantially less than substantially less than $155 million that you would normally leave in that BRA. So big picture, why does that happen?
A couple of reasons to that, Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith. First of all, both bodies are impacted by the property tax relief and other appropriation bills. When you handed over your budget, I think the amount of money that you left on the table was in $72 million range for the floors. Well, more than half of that was expended or appropriated just through the local government bill. If you'll look on page 2, row 36, page 2, row 36, column N is in Nancy. Another big issue is the general fund on the Senate side absorbs all of the liabilities of the SIPA account because it goes away. That's a large amount of money that you might not intuitively think about. because they also lower the spending policy from 5 to 4.5% and eliminate the SIPA account. Because of the manner in which that was done, they also eliminate the guarantee on the SIPA, because the SIPA is gone, and then they also eliminate the guarantee on the school foundation program or the old school major maintenance sub-account. So all of that stuff goes away, so you end up with a large balance on page 5 in those reserve accounts with the absence of that revenue supporting the general operations of government. One more item worth mentioning appears on page 3. The $75 million deposit from the UW Research to the LSRA, while it looks like they saved $75 million, it doesn't support their operating accounts of the general fund and the budget reserve account. So I think those are kind of the big dollar items.
Mr. Chairman. Don, if I could just go back then to the conversation you were having on the SIPA transfer coming out of the traditional source where we split the 2.5% or the 5%, 2.5, 2.5. Then, if I understand you correctly, that diversion of 1.25 that would go to SIPA just stays in the permanent mineral corpus, and it doesn't come to the general fund side. It just, those fund, that, am I tracking that accurately?
No, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. This one is very complicated, and it's multiple amendments. So the first way I would describe it is you reduce the 5% to 4.5.
Okay.
As a result, that reduces the 1.25 to 1, because it's 1 and 1 for the LSRA and SIPA. And then you transfer that 1% to the general fund. That continues for 2 years in fiscal year 25 and 26. It is not guaranteed, so only the investment income that is forecast by Craig gets transferred. There isn't the full 1%. I don't recall the exact amount, but some fraction of that 1% is transferred to the general fund. So the general fund will benefit from additional revenue. On the flip side, it's benefiting from all of the liabilities. So a fraction of the revenue, but all of the liabilities are being borne by the general fund.
So I'm curious, what was the rationale on the floor when that was explained?
Mr. Chairman, the rationale for most of the changes is to simplify the ways in which money is flowing throughout the state. And so the Senate usually has a position of, I believe the term is fewer coffee cans or fewer accounts. And so this is one of those efforts as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the discussion of calendars and various JCCs and whatnot. If a second joint conference committee were to adopt many of the amendments that are put forth here with no new ones, what is the complexity of staff writing all of that? If we took half of the amendments that are already out there and nothing new, is that still a major undertaking, or because they're already in a draft form, you might say it's a simpler process?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, from an entirely practical standpoint, deletes are the easiest for us. Adopt is the second easiest for us. Delete and further amend is the most difficult for us. To your point, if you adopt them, it does not take that much time to compile. Hypothetically, there are, I actually don't know the count, maybe 120 amendments on 11 pages, which will be your JCC report. If you adopted half of them or 80 of them, not a huge lift. However, realistically, you're not going to do that. And the reason being is they don't quite fit together all the time. So you will need to delete and further amend and take a concept from the House side and a concept from the Senate side and meld them together. So those kind of things take time. In a typical joint conference committee, we really like 2 days, which is kind of why this is designed to finish on no later than Friday. Give us Saturday and Sunday to rewrite the budget bill, and then put it out there on the floor for explanation on Monday. That process also takes time. You know, bouncing it back and forth takes about 6 hours. Just messaging from one side to the other side, your colleagues will want to know what you've done. That usually takes about an hour and a half of explanation on both sides. And then you finish that by midnight.
Okay, more questions? Don?
Mr. Chairman, just for our benefit, the only thing that is required of you under the law, under your rules, is to distribute this on the floor and submit it to your members. It's a one-pager, double-sided, which is a list of all of the amendments, including identical and other amendments. That is all that is required. Realistically, prior committees usually explain what each of those does, which Elizabeth did. What would you, like in terms of products for your colleagues? What you have today, do you want copies of the adopted amendment reports, which you received on Friday, which was the full language of the Senate amendments? I've seen it done a variety of different ways, but we can compile that packet and one last point, I think there is one typo that we have that we will correct that and note corrected for the floor.
So I think, Don, obviously we'll go to the summary sheet, the big sheet, and the statutorily required one. My guess is on some of the really big amendments, we'll probably want copies of those, because I think it'll be easier and people can look at them. So, but we'll have to meet and pick out which ones those are, because we don't want to have too big of a pile.
Okay.
And if you have suggestions on which ones those might be, let us know. Yeah, well, the goldenrod will be distributed anyway, so I presume. Okay, anything else? So Don, we're gonna break. We're probably gonna meet informally, but we may need some further education while we're meeting. All right, we'll stand and adjourn.